Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. And today we're going to be tackling a topic that I think is on everyone's minds in the corporate world. It's performance management. And we're diving deep into Chapter 6 of Sylvia Olah's book, The Blind Leading the Disengaged. You can find it on Amazon if you're interested. So hit that follow and subscribe button so you don't miss out on the rest of this deep dive. But the big question we're wrestling with today is this. Does performance management actually manage performance? Or is it, as Sylvia puts it, just a corporate circus act?
Yeah, it's kind of funny, you hear so much about performance management systems and all these initiatives, but in reality, it often feels like a big facade. Like everyone's just going through the motions, appraisals, reviews, trainings. But is anyone actually getting better? Is performance actually improving? Not really.
Yeah, it's like we're all stuck in this performance management theater.
Yeah.
You know, we're playing our roles, but nobody's actually watching the play.
Mm.
Sylvia actually paints this really vivid picture in the book of the corporate world as a performance management circus. Complete with those outdated appraisals, baffling promotions, and team-building activities that are more likely to make you cringe than actually collaborate.
Oh, yeah, the imagery is spot on. You've got these appraisals based on vague competencies like critical thinking or communication skills, which are practically impossible to measure objectively. So you end up with these situations where people get promoted not because they're good at their jobs, but because they're good at playing the game.
Right, it's like we're rewarding people for checking boxes instead of achieving actual results. And Sylvia argues that this competency obsession is actually a major reason why performance management fails to well manage performance.
It creates this disconnect between what we say we value and what we actually reward.
Right.
We say we want innovation and creativity, but then we promote the person who's best at following the rules and keeping their head down.
It's crazy, and it creates this bizarre situation where you end up with people getting promoted who are completely ill-equipped to lead. Which brings us to another juicy topic that Sylvia tackles: leadership.
hmm
She basically comes out and says, not everyone is cut out to lead.
Yeah, it's true though, isn't it? We have this cultural obsession with leadership. Everyone wants to be a leader, but very few people actually understand what it takes. And Sylvia gives these two really contrasting examples in the book that I think perfectly illustrate this point.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Hmm.
Tell me about these examples.
So first we have Bob's a well-meaning guy, but he's completely incompetent as a leader. He's full of confidence, reads all the leadership books, attends all the seminars. But when it comes to actually leading a team, he completely falls flat on his face.
So it's like he's learned all the theory, but he has no idea how to actually apply it in practice.
Exactly. And then on the other hand, we have John. John is the opposite of Bob. He's a shrewd, cutthroat businessman, laser-focused on the bottom line. He's a master manipulator, and he's not afraid to step on a few toes to get what he wants.
So he might be a good businessman, but is he a good leader?
That's the question, isn't it? And Sylvia argues that the answer is a resounding no. She makes this clear distinction between being a good business person and being a good leader, and points out that the two are not always synonymous.
Interesting. And this kind of ties into her critique of the traditional performance management system, which often focuses on fixing weaknesses rather than leveraging strengths.
It's the whole deficiency mindset trap, right? We're so obsessed with identifying and correcting people's weaknesses that we forget to nurture their strengths. And Sylvia shares this personal anecdote in the book about being really good at managing a particular department, but ultimately hating it because it didn't align with her strengths and what she was naturally good at.
It's like being forced to wear a shoe that's 2 sizes too small. You might be able to walk in it, but it's going to be painful and you're not going to get very far.
Yeah, exactly. And she argues that this approach not only leads to unhappy employees, but it also stifles innovation and creativity. It's like forcing a square peg into a round hole.
We need to be finding roles and environments where people can actually thrive by utilizing their strengths, not constantly trying to make them fit into some predetermined mold. Another interesting point that Sylvia makes is about promotions. She suggests that promotions can sometimes actually lower the bar for performance. How does that work?
Well, it happens when promotions are based on things like tenure or like potential rather than actual competence. She gives this example as someone who got promoted simply because they'd been with the company for a long time. Not because they were the best person for the job, but because it was seen as like their due. You know what I mean?
So it's like rewarding loyalty over ability, which might feel good in the short term, but ultimately hurts the company in the long run.
Right. And it feeds into this larger issue of office politics and what Sylvia calls the price of BS. All that time we spend navigating power dynamics, crafting carefully worded emails, worrying about who's getting credit for what, is a massive waste of energy and resources.
It's exhausting,
Yep.
and it creates this whole culture of distrust and competition.
Totally. And Sylvia even discusses her work at the Strengths Company, where she actually developed programs specifically to combat these challenges, to foster a more mature and honest work culture.
So it's not about pretending that office politics don't exist,
Yeah.
but about actively addressing them and creating environments where people feel safe to speak up and collaborate without fear of being sabotaged or whatever. And this kind of ties into another interesting point that Sylvia raises, this idea that the so-called talent shortage might actually be more of a talent blindness problem. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's a lot of truth to that. It's not that there aren't talented people out there. It's that companies often fail to recognize and nurture the talent they already have.
It's like having a garden full of beautiful flowers, but ignoring them and then wondering why they're not blooming.
Exactly. And Sylvia gives this great example in the book of these general managers who were basically bypassing corporate bureaucracy to get things done. They understood that sometimes the best way to lead is to get out of the way and empower your team.
They're the ones who are willing to kind of break the rules to create a more supportive environment for their teams. And I love that she acknowledges that individual strengths, while valuable, can also create challenges at work.
It's like anything else, too much of a good thing can be a bad thing.
Right. And she gives this kind of humorous rundown of how each of the 34 Clifton strengths can actually manifest negatively if not understood or managed properly.
Right. Like, for example, someone with high achievers might prioritize work over everything else, including their own health and well-being.
Oh, yeah. Or someone with a strong belief theme might have such strong convictions that they come across as inflexible or uncollaborative.
Exactly. So it's all about finding that balance, understanding your strengths and how they might impact others, and learning to manage them effectively.
Which brings us to another major point of contention in Sylvia's book, The Dreaded Bell Curve. She really takes it to task, arguing that forcing employees into this arbitrary distribution is not only unfair, but actually promotes mediocrity. What are your thoughts on the bell curve?
I think it's a fundamentally flawed system. It's based on this idea that only a certain percentage of people can be high performers, which simply isn't true.
It's like saying only a certain number of flowers are allowed to bloom in a garden.
Exactly. And Sylvia tells this great story about a chief concierge whose entire team exceeded expectations. It just completely shatters this whole notion of the bell curve. And what's really shocking? The bell curve is often used as a cost-cutting measure. There are even leaked documents from companies like Microsoft and Amazon that basically instructed managers to deliberately lower performance ratings to save money.
Wow, that's messed up. It's like they're prioritizing profits over people. And speaking of prioritizing profits, that constant pressure to perform is leading to a burnout epidemic, which Sylvia also addresses in the chapter.
Yeah, she argues that this relentless focus on KPIs and performance metrics is creating a culture of stress and anxiety,
Yeah.
which ultimately leads to burnout and disengagement.
It's like we're all on this hamster wheel running and running, but getting nowhere fast.
Right. And Sylvia reflects on this shift she's observed in the hospitality industry, from this fun, get-it-done culture to one that's dominated by KPIs and performance anxiety. It's sad, really. It's like the joy has been sucked out of work.
And then we wonder why people are so disengaged and burned out.
Right. We need to rethink our whole approach to performance management. We need to create environments that are more supportive and less focused on this constant pressure and measurement.
And I love that she questions this idea that everyone can be empowered.
It's true, though, isn't it? Not everyone wants to be empowered. Some people thrive in environments where they have clear instructions and a lot of structure. Others need more autonomy and flexibility to really flourish.
It's about recognizing that people are different and that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to empowerment.
And Sylvia really emphasizes the importance of hiring people with self-awareness, self-esteem, and a sense of responsibility. It's like empowerment isn't just about giving people freedom, it's about giving them the tools and support they need to succeed.
That's a really important distinction. And now, for a real head-scratcher, Sylvia presents this finding that low performers are often more engaged than high performers. How is that even possible?
I know, right? It is a surprising finding, but she backs it up with data, showing that low performers often have higher engagement scores in things like effort recommending the organization, even leadership accountability.
So maybe those happy employee surveys aren't telling the whole story.
Right. And Sylvia challenges this whole narrative around millennial and Gen Z disengagement. Maybe younger generations are just more attuned to the absurdities of the traditional performance management system, and they're less willing to play along.
They're seeing that the emperor has no clothes and they're calling it out.
Exactly. And that brings us to another target of Sylvia's critique, the annual performance review. She calls it the drama queen of performance management. And I think a lot of people would agree with that assessment.
It's this big, clunky, often incredibly subjective process that just seems designed to create more drama than actual results.
It relies on these vague behavioral competencies that are open to interpretation, and it often devolves into these calibration sessions where managers are arguing about who deserves a higher rating. It's a mess.
So what's the alternative?
Sylvia proposes ditching the behavioral competencies altogether and replacing them with clear, measurable KPIs. She argues that we need to focus on both business goals and what she calls people KPIs that actually reflect leadership effectiveness.
So instead of judging people based on their potential or how well they fit into the culture, we should be focusing on tangible results and how leaders are contributing to the well-being of their teams.
Exactly. And this leads into another important point, the need for flexibility in performance management practices.
Okay, let's unpack that. What does flexibility in performance management actually look like?
It's about recognizing that different personalities, motivations, even generational preferences require different approaches.
Not everyone's motivated by the same things or responds to feedback in the same way.
Right. And Sylvia gives some great examples of how to make performance management more flexible. For instance, she suggests replacing traditional feedback with coaching conversations that focus on future actions rather than dwelling on past mistakes. She also talks about shifting from annual appraisals to more frequent check-ins and offering alternative reward systems like monthly service charges in addition to annual bonuses.
So it's about creating a more dynamic and responsive system that meets people's needs and recognizes their contributions in a more timely and meaningful way.
And this brings us to another challenge that many managers face, finding that sweet spot between micromanaging and neglecting employees.
It's a tough balance to strike. Too much oversight can be stifling, but too little can lead to chaos.
And Sylvia acknowledges that there is a middle ground. She gives this great example of how she effectively addressed a situation where a beach at a resort she was working with was consistently dirty. Instead of micromanaging every detail of the cleanup, she gave clear instructions, checked in regularly, and offered positive reinforcement when things were done well.
It's about empowering people to take ownership while still providing guidance and support along the way.
Exactly. And you know something else that's interesting? She challenges this whole notion that importance in the workplace is tied to your relationship with your superiors or how vocal you are in meetings.
Yeah, it's that classic image of the person who's always trying to impress the boss and dominate the conversation, even if they don't have much substance to contribute.
Right. Sylvia argues that true importance comes from making a meaningful contribution regardless of your position or title. And she presents this framework for understanding different expressions of importance based on leadership style.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this framework.
Well, she says that executors derive a sense of importance from getting things done efficiently and effectively. Strategic thinkers find importance in developing long-term vision and solutions. Relationship builders feel important when they're fostering strong team dynamics and creating a positive and supportive work environment. And influencers feel important when they're advocating for the team's needs and achievements and ensuring that their voices are heard.
I love that. It really highlights how different people find fulfillment and purpose in their work. It's not just about climbing the corporate ladder or getting a corner office.
Right. And this leads us to Sylvia's proposal for a new organizational structure that she believes would be more effective and equitable.
Okay, I'm ready for a revolution. Let's hear it.
She envisions a four-layer system with executors at the foundation doing what they do best, executing tasks and getting things done. Above them are the managers or supervisors who provide oversight and guidance to the executors. Then you have the experts who bring specialized knowledge and experience to the table and offer strategic advice to the leader. And finally, at the top, you have the leader who sets the overall vision and direction for the organization.
It's a really interesting model because it explicitly recognizes the value of expertise and experience. It's not about promoting people into management roles just because they've been with the company for a long time. It's about putting people in positions where they can leverage their strengths and make the most impactful contributions.
And Sylvia is quite critical of the traditional hierarchy, which she believes often forces people into roles that they're not suited for and don't actually want.
Right, like the classic example of the top salesperson who gets promoted to sales manager, but is absolutely terrible at managing people.
Exactly. And that kind of mismatch can lead to a lot of frustration and dysfunction within an organization.
It's like we're trying to put square pegs into round holes. And this brings us back to the core issue that Sylvia is addressing in this chapter, the brokenness of the traditional performance management system. We've talked about a lot of the problems, but what's the solution? How do we actually fix this?
Well, Sylvia advocates for a pretty radical shift in mindset. She argues that we need to move away from this focus on fixing weaknesses and instead focus on leveraging strengths. We need to recognize that people are more likely to excel when they're doing work that aligns with their natural talents and motivations.
It's about creating a more human-centered approach to performance management, recognizing that people are not just cogs in a machine, they're individuals with unique skills, talents, and aspirations.
And this requires a willingness to challenge the status quo, to question our assumptions, and to experiment with new approaches. Sylvia is basically saying that the traditional performance management system is not only broken, it's actively harming both individuals and organizations.
So it's time for a revelation.
I think so. We need to rethink the way we think about and manage performance if we want to create work environments that are more supportive, more engaging, and ultimately more productive.
I agree. And I think this is a good point to pause and let our listeners digest all of these thought-provoking ideas. We've covered a lot of ground in this episode, and we'll be back for part 2 to continue the conversation.
Picking up where we left off, we were talking about flexibility and performance management. It's one of those buzzwords that gets thrown around a lot in corporate settings, but rarely translates into actual practice.
Right. Everyone talks about agile and flexible work environments, but when you actually look at how things are done, it's often a very different story.
Yeah, Sylvia Olah really hits the nail on the head in the book when she points out that this lack of flexibility is one of the key reasons why these traditional performance management systems fail. They're just too rigid, too standardized to account for the unique needs and motivations of individual employees.
It's like trying to fit everyone into the same size shoe.
Yeah.
Some people are going to be swimming in them while others are getting blisters.
Exactly. And this one-size-fits-all approach just doesn't work. It ultimately leads to disengagement and resentment. Sylvia argues that we need to move away from this model and embrace a more personalized approach that actually recognizes the diversity of human talent and potential.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? What does a more flexible performance management system look like in practice?
Well, Sylvia suggests a few really interesting ideas. First, she talks about shifting from traditional feedback, which often focuses on past mistakes, to coaching conversations that are more forward-looking and action-oriented.
That makes a lot of sense.
Mm.
Instead of dwelling on what went wrong, we should be helping people learn from their experiences and focus on how they can improve in the future.
Exactly. And she also suggests moving away from the dreaded annual performance review, which can be a pretty anxiety-inducing experience for everyone involved, and replacing it with more frequent check-ins. This allows for more regular communication and feedback so issues can be addressed before they become major problems.
Yeah, it creates a more ongoing dialogue between managers and employees, which can really help to foster trust and collaboration.
Totally. And finally, she talks about offering alternative reward systems, things like monthly service charges in addition to those annual bonuses, recognizing that different people are motivated by different things.
Right. It's about tailoring the rewards to the individual rather than assuming that everyone wants the same thing. And this brings us to another challenge that I think a lot of managers struggle with, finding that right balance between providing support and giving employees autonomy. How do you avoid micromanaging while still ensuring that people are meeting expectations and, actually getting the job done?
Yeah, it's a delicate dance, for sure. And Sylvia acknowledges that there is a sweet spot, a middle ground between being overly controlling and completely hands-off.
She uses that great example of the dirty beach at the resort to kind of illustrate this point.
Right. Instead of micromanaging every detail of the cleanup, she gave clear instructions checked in regularly and offered positive reinforcement when things were done well.
It's about empowering people to take ownership while still providing guidance and support along the way.
And she also challenges this whole notion that importance in the workplace is tied to, your relationship with your superiors or how vocal you are in meetings.
It's that classic image of the person who's always trying to, impress the boss and dominate the conversation, even if they don't actually have much substance to contribute.
Right. Sylvia argues that true importance comes from making a meaningful contribution regardless of your position or title. And she introduces this really fascinating framework for understanding different expressions of importance based on leadership style.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued. Tell me more about this framework.
Well, she says that executors derive a sense of importance from getting things done efficiently and effectively. Strategic thinkers find importance in developing long term vision and solutions. Relationship builders feel important when they're fostering strong team dynamics and creating a positive and supportive work environment. And influencers feel important when they're advocating for the team's needs and achievements and making sure that their voices are heard.
I love that. It really highlights how different people find fulfillment and purpose in their work. It's not just about climbing the corporate ladder or,
Yeah.
getting a corner office.
Exactly. And this leads us to Sylvia's proposal for a new organizational structure that she believes would be more effective and equitable.
Okay, I'm ready for a revolution. Let's hear it.
She envisions a four-layer system with executors at the foundation, doing what they do best, executing tasks and getting things done. Above them are the managers or supervisors who provide oversight and guidance to the executors. Then you have the experts who bring specialized knowledge and experience to the table and offer strategic advice to the leader. And finally, at top, you have the leader who sets the overall vision and direction for the organization.
It's a really interesting model because it explicitly recognizes the value of expertise and experience. It's not about promoting people into management roles just because they've been with the company for a long time. It's about putting people in positions where they can leverage their strengths and make the most impactful contributions.
And Sylvia is quite critical of the traditional hierarchy, which she believes often forces people into roles that they're not suited for and don't actually want.
Right. It's like that classic example of the top salesperson who gets promoted to sales manager, but is absolutely terrible at managing people.
Exactly. And that kind of mismatch can lead to a lot of frustration and dysfunction within an organization.
It's like we're trying to put square pegs into round holes.
Hmm.
And this kind of brings us back to the core issue that Sylvia is addressing in this chapter, the brokenness of the traditional performance management system. We've talked about a lot of the problems, but what's the solution? How do we actually fix this?
Well, Sylvia advocates for a pretty radical shift in mindset. She argues that we need to move away from this focus on fixing weaknesses and instead focus on leveraging strengths. We need to recognize that people are more likely to excel when they're doing work that aligns with their natural talents and motivations.
It's about creating a more human-centered approach to performance management, recognizing that people are not just cogs in a machine, they're individuals with unique skills, talents, and aspirations.
And this requires a willingness to challenge the status quo, to question our assumptions, and to experiment with new approaches. Sylvia is basically saying that the traditional performance management system is not only broken, it's actively harming both individuals and organizations.
So it's time for a revolution.
I think so. We need to rethink the way we think about and manage performance if we want to create work environments that are more supportive, more engaging, and ultimately more productive.
I agree. And I think this is a good point to pause and let our listeners digest all of these thought-provoking ideas. We've covered a lot of ground in this episode, and we'll be back for part 3 to continue the conversation. All right, welcome back for the final part of our deep dive into performance management and Sylvia Olah's book, The Blind Leading the Disengaged.
Yeah, it's been a pretty thought-provoking conversation so far, hasn't it?
One of the things that's really stuck with me is this idea that incompetence is often a systemic problem, not just, an individual failing.
Yeah, it's kind of scary when you think about it, right? Like we've created these systems and structures where incompetence can actually thrive.
It's like we've accidentally built the perfect breeding ground for it.
And Sylvia points out that a lot of this comes from things like, bad hiring practices, inadequate training, and this general kind of tolerance for mediocrity that seems to permeate a lot of organizations.
It's like we're so focused on just filling positions and checking boxes that we forget about the actual skills and knowledge that people need to do the job effectively.
Right. And you know what's even worse? This incompetence doesn't just impact the individual, it can really drag down the whole team.
It's like a virus that spreads and infects everyone around it.
And this is where the importance of good supervision comes in.
Right? Someone needs to be there to, nip this stuff in the bud before it gets out of control.
Sylvia gives a really helpful list in the book of kind of red flags that managers should be watching for. Things like, employees making shortcuts, missing deadlines, constantly disappearing from work, or just consistently failing to follow standards.
So the supervisor is kind of like a gardener tending to their plants. You got to pull out those weeds before they take over the whole garden.
Exactly. And she talks about the importance of giving clear instructions, setting clear expectations, checking in regularly, and, offering positive reinforcement when things are done well.
It's about creating that supportive environment where people feel valued, respected, actually motivated to do good work.
And, I think this ties back to her broader point about creating a more human-centered workplace, a place where people feel like they can actually bring their whole selves to work and, not have to constantly be trying to fit into some narrow box.
That's the dream, isn't it? A workplace where everyone feels valued and supported and can actually do their best work.
But getting there requires a pretty fundamental shift in mindset. We need to stop focusing on fixing weaknesses and start focusing on leveraging strengths.
Right. Let people do what they're good at.
And be willing to, question those traditional assumptions about how things should be done.
Because as Sylvia's saying, a lot of those traditional approaches are not just ineffective, they're actively harmful.
It's time for a revolution, I think.
So what would you say is the biggest takeaway from this book? What's that one thing you want listeners to walk away with?
For me, it's this idea that we have the power to create better work environments. It might not be easy, and it's definitely going to take some work, but it's possible. And it's so worth it because when we create those kinds of environments, everyone benefits. Individuals, organizations, and society as a whole.
Well said. And I think that's a perfect note to end on. We've covered a lot of ground in these three parts, exploring the good, the bad, and the ugly of performance management and the corporate world. But the most important thing is to remember that we have the power to change things. So let's all go out there and create workplaces that are more human, more fulfilling, and ultimately more productive. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.